In this video, I want to talk about how to organize and develop your literary analysis essay or your poetry explication essay. And we're going to do this by first taking a look back at the introduction. So the sample introduction that we looked at in the previous video is on the screen before you. And I want to highlight the thesis statement, which you see here in yellow. Our thesis statement reads, using direct address, repetition, and water imagery, Clifton explores the ways race and class intermingle to complicate the speaker's moral dilemma. The thesis is one of the most important pieces of the essay because it provides a bit of a roadmap both to the reader and the writer so that we know where we're going. We know that all of the main topics that are mentioned in the thesis are going to be elaborated on and developed throughout the body. And there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. We can organize our essay in what might be considered a point-by-point organizational method. In that case, we would discuss all of the examples of literary device number one, all of the examples of literary device number two, and all of the examples of literary device number three. So, how does direct address show up in the poem, and how is that technique contributing to the meaning of the poem as a whole? How does sound repetition show up in the poem, and how is sound repetition contributing to the meaning of the poem as a whole? Finally, how is water imagery showing up in the poem, and how is that contributing to the meaning of the poem as a whole? Now, I don't want you to think about these as three paragraphs. I want you to think about them as three sections, because you may have multiple paragraphs discussing direct address, you may have multiple paragraphs discussing sound repetition, etc. Another way to think about organizing your paper would be in a sort of chronological fashion. So instead of discussing or organizing your paper around literary techniques that are used, we'll instead organize them around stanzas. So you might discuss all of stanza one and how direct address, sound repetition, and water imagery are showing up in stanza one, as well as the effect on the meaning in stanza one. And then so on. Same thing with stanza two, same thing with stanza three. Now, I do want to pause here and make a point that if you're writing about a poem like Tiara that has many, many stanzas, you're probably not going to organize like a paragraph per stanza, but you're going to combine discussing like stanzas in a single paragraph. Conversely, if you're working with a poem that does not have stanzas or has very long stanzas, like Night Waitress, you're going to group images or lines in ways that are logical, but still talking or still discussing the poem in a chronological order. Let's take a look at an example of what a sort of stanza by stanza discussion of the Lost Baby poem might look like. So this is a discussion of the first stanza using the same thesis that we observed earlier. We're going to be paying attention to the ways direct address, sound repetition, and water imagery show up in the poem. You'll notice that in this example, the first paragraph only is able to address two of the literary techniques, direct address and sound repetition. A following paragraph would then address some of the water imagery. So Clifton's poem begins with the speaker's direct address to her unborn child. The speaker narrates the experience of abortion in much the same way a parent might narrate the story of a child's birth. Clifton writes, "The time I dropped your almost body, down, down to meet the waters under the city and run one with the sewage of the sea." The direct address invites the reader into an intimate exchange between mother and child, and the poetic device establishes a confessional tone. The first stanza is one of regret. The speaker has dropped the child. Its body has traveled down to a place where sewage meets sea. The images and alliteration emphasize the regret the speaker feels. In particular, the repetition of down and the slant rhyme with drowning and drowned, which appear later in the stanza, emphasize the speaker's regret or connect the speaker's sense of regret to her sense of overwhelm. So just notice the way that the paragraph is organized. The first half of the paragraph is discussing direct address. We've made sure to include an example from the poem and also to discuss what that example is doing, right? It's creating that intimate connection between speaker and child that the reader is invited to listen in on. Notice too, in the second half of the paragraph, that specific word choices and examples of sound repetition are used, and then a discussion of how that sound is contributing to the meaning of the work as a whole is also included in the paragraph. A longer example of a student of an essay is included on Blackboard. Of course, you will also find two examples